Hello dear students, I am Sitaraman currently Vice Chancellor, Global University. I would like to now discuss Chapter 6, Module 1, and Chapter 6 deals with technology and human rights issues. It tries to present a framework in which we can understand what's happening to many of those concerns which those who are interested in human rights have carried over the years with the onset of new technologies in the last 20 years. But we also need to know what actually was the case with earlier. Broadly speaking, what is the connection between technology and human rights first of all, and what kinds of issues technology opened up for those who are concerned about human rights. For instance, a fundamental question is whether technology facilitates a greater realization of human rights or whether technology takes away the capacity to exercise human rights. And I think that's a very polarized question, but nevertheless that's a fundamental question that keeps coming back. And I think that's the kind of questions we would like to ask. And the chapter presents a set of case studies, and through that we will try and illustrate the kind of complex issues that we have to see when we are talking about technology and human rights. In chapter 1, I would like to provide a broader framework, a brief history in terms of the background in which the debates on technology and human rights have taken place. And with the onset of new technologies, what's the kinds of issues that have arisen in the last 20 years. That's what we are going to do in this module 1. Let me try and frame the technology question. The technology is always seen in human history as an important aspect of human civilization. The progress and civilization of human societies is very closely connected to the imagination of technological inventions. We have always seen in the past the Enlightenment is connected to scientific and technological progress of 16th and 17th centuries. In a very similar way, at each and every major breakthrough in human history, be it industrial print civilization of 18th century capitalism, or the 20th century finance capitalism, or now in the era of internet, the kind of explosion of telecommunication technologies and perpetual online network societies kind of situation. We face technology in every aspect of our life, and it seemed to be impacting on every nook and corner of the kind of life we live in. So therefore, it is important we understand how such a great force in human civilization as technology means to understanding human rights issues, which is a different kind of a force that came to civilize. The technology also claims to civilize, and therefore they seem to be having certain kind of parallel relationship with civilization and progress. But do they share same qualities, or are they different kind of species? That is what we are going to see. At first, there is an issue of technology and citizenship. In other words, what is now known as the science technology studies or STS studies repeatedly brought to us that the technological developments of course have an ambiguous relationship with democracy. In other words, technology could contribute to enhancement of democracy, but at the same time there is no democratic process within the making and designing of technological process, and that has a very peculiar sort of a scenario. In other words, technological decisions are made by fewer, smaller, powerful coteries, and they are going to impact in the entire society. And so that lack of democracy is itself a question. And at the same time, we know technology facilitates greater participation. Technology opens up possibility of engagement of citizens with democratic political process, and that's obviously on the positive side. So there seemed to be a democracy and citizenship problem straight away with technology. But then how one could try and understand the major arguments in this particular context? It goes without saying there are two kinds of major schools. One could be referred as utopians, that is, those who would see technology as necessarily contributing to human progress and civilization, and therefore it is greater likelihood that technology would also contribute to greater realization of human rights. So in other words, it will impact human rights in a positive way. That's the sort of utopianism that is very much present. So it is present in international agencies, it is present in across the board the larger industrial companies, corporations. All of them hold technology as a key factor to bring efficiency, to bring profitability, and also bring greater access to democracy and political citizenship alike. The other side is dystopians. Dystopians are those who perpetually suspect, or they are very skeptical of the capacity of technology to transform our lives. Not in any way they are saying technology won't affect, but transforming our lives democratically. So in other words, they perceive technology with great suspicion and see technology as something that is intruding, that is restricting our ways of behavior, that is causing newer kinds of concerns, say for instance, in more general terms, for instance affecting our privacy because of perpetual online network societies. Those are all skeptical, if not more seriously dystopian views of technology and what it can do to us. In that broad context of technology and democracy and human rights relationship, let me take back to the brief historical context of post-Second World War, in which the technology question was scrutinized. In the early days, thanks to the Charter of United Nations, which recognizes the goal of social development, the United Nations organized a series of conferences on science and technology for development. So in other words, there was a great utopia that science and technology are going to help transform the entire world into a developed sort of process. This is a way of catching up for third world or newly independent erstwhile colonial societies. And so therefore these conferences were full of ideas as to technology transfer, as to what is the way that the corporate capital can be facilitated in terms of its movement from developed world into the third world context, and so on. So there is a lot of buzz around technology science coming to really transform the everyday lives of third world societies. Well, needless to say, in all societies, including India, also passed through a variety of technological interventions. For instance, the Green Revolution happened in India in mid-1960s, which seemed to have deeply impacted the way agriculture is done in our country, for instance. Right? So in a very similar way, so the technology and its possible transformative potential for third world societies was taken as an unqualified good in those conferences. What happened in the year 1968 is the first human rights conference that took place in the city of Tehran in Iran, and that was the first conference in which we have seen the first skeptical note that came on technology. One of the articles of the Tehran Proclamation makes it very clear that it is time that we take technology seriously, and there is no guarantee that always technology would be good for realizing human rights. And therefore, there is a need for certain kind of scrutiny of technological developments, keeping human rights interest in mind. And that was the first caution that comes from the United Nations, and from then on there is a lot of developments within the United Nations that brought some kind of codification about major concerns at the intersection of technological developments and human rights. In the year 1975, the Secretary General of the United Nations basically tried to create 4 major reports on the science and technology developments and its implications to human rights. The 4 reports deal with 4 different themes, and they need to be specially identified because most of them still have great significance in our contemporary context. The first one dealt with computer data protection and privacy concerns of the individual, which is still a major concern in all new technologies context. In mid-1970s, needless to say, the computers were too early. The PC was not yet on the horizon. The internet is still a futuristic idea. Though of course it was there in certain defense services and very restricted sense of internet was available, it was not in any way commercially available to the kind of extent that we are familiar today. So the point about the privacy and data protection was a concern, a futuristic concern, the report of the Secretary General presents. And obviously it tries to present a variety of questions as to what are the ways to protect, who is responsible, what is the responsibility of the state, and if it is a corporate actor, what kind of privacy obligations the corporate actor should have, and so on. Once again, these are all concerns that we see repeatedly coming to play in our discussions, say for instance pertaining to the internet service providers role, or the larger companies like Microsoft or Google or Apple providing these services and collecting our data, right? Who is responsible and what is the extent of obligation and such other questions. And that is the first report of the Secretary General in the year 1975. The second report dealt with labor rights. So in other words, as all of us are familiar, the labor law is about 2 kinds of rights. One is right to work and the other one is rights at work. The report largely dealt with right to work because this is about employment implication. So in other words, what does automation mean to the future of employment? Would it affect negatively? Would it reduce employment? Or would it contribute to creating high-skilled, greater wage-oriented employment? This is a major debate through and through all a post-World War period, within which we have seen again a divided opinion. Some would consider the technology of course would cause retrenchment, would create possibilities of unemployment, and therefore is a great concern for human rights of workers. And some others always said, and especially those who are economists, arguing this theory of aggregate demand, that would mean that while in the short run technological automation creates unemployment, in the long run, however, it is likely to create a greater number of jobs which are high paid and therefore high skilled, and that is more desirable for development of society and uplifting the wage levels in any social process. And this is a debate of course that continued until late 1990s, when the OECD finally declared that we seem to have reached, at least in the Western world, a situation in which we reached a jobless growth. So in other words, there is economic growth, there is a possibility of expansion of economic wealth, but it is not creating any kind of new jobs, or at least as much as it ought to have done. So that is not happening. So that is a kind of a concern. From that moment onwards, we have seen the Euro-American world having bouts of unemployment concerns, various kinds of anxieties. Some countries a little more, like Spain and Greece, and some others probably a little less. But nevertheless, jobless growth is a major concern in this particular context. The Secretary General's report of 1975 does identify some of these concerns and present a variety of measures, including the one that ILO deploys, which is the responsibility of the state on one side, the employer on the other, and trade union at the bottom. And in all this triad, the kind of responsibilities, reskilling, re-employability, and such other kinds of obligations have been talked about. All these were with a clear idea that there is a possibility for the sovereign state to make some interventions in creating such structures which would mitigate the impact of short-term unemployment caused by technological automation. This is 1975, of course, but that's a concern. It continues to be even today, though that particular approach is by and large absent in the United Nations discussions today. The third, and once again a very continuing debate, is on the bioethics. All of us know medical technologies have grown. There is all kinds of possible interventions at one level in human body, at a different level in the biosphere. We are tampering with genetic alterations of food, of other kinds of plant mechanisms, also trying to create human cloning and a variety of other such technological interventions in the biosphere. And these interventions, once again in very early and incipient stage in mid-70s, caused a lot of concern as to what are the limits, what is the way the human rights question and ethics question can be brought to bear upon in forging and conceiving projects in biotechnological research. And I think those are concerns once again very pertinent for even today's debate. And so we should go back and read the 1975 Secretary General report. And the fourth report deals with the broader implications of the moral well-being of the human person. So in other words, what technology does to the larger goals of human journey in terms of the moral fabric of the human being, in terms of the kind of ethical and other concerns that it could create. For instance, one such concern would be whether technology erodes human agency. Human agency means, as all of us are aware, it is capacity to act in a given context. So in other words, can technology facilitate agency or can technology impede the agency? And I think it is a very ambiguous scenario. As I was already saying in the beginning, that technology simultaneously erodes citizenship, but it facilitates new forms of participation. Technology erodes privacy, but it might create new possibilities of thinking about privacy. And I think that's the kind of an ambiguous problem, and unfortunately there is no final point on this, but it is important to reflect on these questions. And therefore, the Secretary General reports of 1975 paved a new way of pegging the questions of human rights vis-a-vis the emerging technologies. And I think from that time, last 30 years, there is a great journey of detailing, conceptualization, and theoretical advancement in looking at questions of law, human rights, and technological advancements. Now let me turn to the issue of new technologies. The arrival of new technologies, I don't need to announce. Last 20 years, all of our lives is completely changed by the new telecommunication technologies. Beginning with internet and now with all things being networked, we seem to be, as some philosophers suggest, into a networked society, where a number of conventional ideas seem to have been either transformed or transgressed. For instance, today the network society makes a number of conventional ideas of sovereignty very problematic, if not irrelevant. In a very similar way, the new network society and continuous online life makes privacy as a concern, but at the same time it could absolutely make privacy as a non-issue. In a very similar way, it has created greater possibilities of citizen participation and mobilizations. We have seen the role of social media, both negative as well as positive. Social media was critical in mobilizing in democratic movements in various parts of the world. But social media is equally responsible, or at least a platform through which such mobilization happened, in creating rumors and therefore creating conflict and tensions in society in the form of communal rights in India in recent past, or matters related to race and genocide issues elsewhere. Technology played an important role. That obviously being the broader sort of cap. So what is it that we need to take as critical issues vis-a-vis the human rights question we are talking about? So I flag broadly 4 important themes. The first one is obviously, what does privacy mean in the new technological society? It is true, the perpetual online cell phone that we all carry, the smartphone, makes our life very easy, but at the same time leaves a perpetual internet footprint that could be tracked, that could be mapped, and then therefore a variety of things that we could be targeted for, both by state as well as by market. So the question then is, what does privacy mean in this kind of change situation? I mean, of course, I can't say that I'm on Facebook, but my page should not be read. It looks a little ridiculous. But at the same time, there are various ways by which privacy applies to Facebook. In a very similar way, in various ways, privacy applies to my email account. But would that be within the limits of what the corporate actor provides? Or is there any way the citizens can enhance that space? And I think that is a space of activism. And we are already seeing a variety of activist groups on the internet trying to promote privacy, create new kinds of possibilities, and thereby putting pressure on the corporate actors to enhance the privacy space. Would it be foolproof? I don't think it was in past. I don't think it would be in future. What should be our approach? I hope we need a far more closer scrutiny, and we will do in one of the modules as we go in this particular chapter. The second issue I would like to flag off is the question of sovereignty. Sovereignty is very central to protection of human rights, because sovereignty is state capacity to intervene. What network society has done is to erode that capacity of the state to intervene. I mean, a number of things that go on which the state has very little control, or it has to invest far more resources than what otherwise it could have done in making small progress in controlling. Even a society like China, with great resources and authoritarian practices, is not able to control its internet walls. So in other words, there is a problem of total control. There is possibility of sovereignty still asserting here and there, but that is only a very limited sphere. So what does then sovereignty mean today in those aspects? Well, it is true, sovereignty still matters in controlling borders in real physical travel. But the virtual aspect of life, sovereignty has become nearly non-existent. And I think that may not be an overstatement, because there are many aspects of which today virtually we could do where the state has very little understanding of it. The situation is changing though. It is creating a global grid of data and possible ways by which massive programs that could decipher the movements of this virtual world, and whereby the surveillance can become a new form of control mechanism. And the program of PRISM in the US and Netra in India and many such programs elsewhere are clear indications of that capacity of the states to pull together their sovereign selves in creating greater surveillance structures, and therefore making our lives more vulnerable than ever before in that particular aspect. And finally, I would add a very interesting point, which is the debate about posthumanism. A number of philosophers speculate and argue that we are already in a world of posthuman context. What is posthuman? It is something that of course one has to interpret. The posthuman would mean what was considered as the enlightenment human being, whose rational citizen self was central in creating political and economic orders of our times. And that self seemed to be already transformed or is under transformation. And I think that is what one could broadly reflect as posthumanism. But it is also how machine has become an integral part of the human being. So in other words, the gadgets that we wear, the kind of instruments that we use, the kind of technology that is necessary for us to become what we are in everyday context is the post-human aspect of our everyday life. So in that sense, there seemed to be a transition in the way that human being is perceived in contemporary society. But what is the implication? Well, there are broadly one or two implications. There is one implication is an old question, is human agency. What happens to human beings' capacity to act without technology? Is technology going to determine the way we act? So that's one. Technological dependency and agency is one problem. But there is also another problem, a rather probably futuristic one, but it is very much there, which is, for instance, the famous Hollywood director Stanley Kubrick tried to predict 40 years ago when he made Space Odyssey 2000. What was the question? Can machines acquire emotions? And it is very interesting, recent past, both Hollywood as well as Bollywood and of course various other cinema woods that we have in India produced a variety of films of robots where produced a variety of robo-based films in which the machine acquires a kind of emotion, for instance. So while it is of course fiction, while it is still a popular cultural context, it is very much there as an imagination that what if the machines acquire emotion? And I think that fundamental philosophical question is very much at the heart of the imagination of the post-human as well. I flagged the four broad themes. So let me now quickly conclude what I am going to say about the technology human rights relationship. 30 years ago, Christopher Veeramanthri, at the time a professor in the United Nations University in Tokyo and subsequently who became a judge in ICJ, wrote a book called Slumbering Sentinels, Law and Human Rights in the Wake of Technology. And that was an interesting book in which what Professor Veeramanthri tried to do is to present the problem technology has created to the human being. One is loss of agency. Two, the erosion of conventional sovereign capacity of the state, both of which I have already spoken about. But he was one of the earliest academics to raise those questions vis-a-vis technology in early 1980s. It's an interesting book, and therefore it flagged off a variety of issues for us to reflect today. Those two questions, how should we understand? Should we feel threatened, so we'll go to dystopia, or we say no, it is not likely to happen and therefore we stick to utopia? I would conclude my point with the broader arguments extended by a philosopher of technology in our times, Andrew Feinberg, who tried to suggest the following, that he said the political philosophers have a particular approach to scrutinizing technology, and philosophers of technology have another kind of approach to scrutinizing technology. The political philosophy approach, according to Feinberg, is what I could call the normative approach. So in other words, we take human rights and try and see what has technology done to those human rights. Is it impacting negatively? What is the immediate impact? What is likelihood of future impact? And so on. What Feinberg tries to tell as a contrast is the philosophers of technology are of course interested, and they can learn from political philosophers the way the normative critique happens, but they are equally interested to understand how such technology which is impacting human rights is actually originally designed. What are the ways by which such technological processes and decisions are taken by individual scientists, collective groups of scientists, or state actors or corporate actors? How can those decisions be democratized in such a way that there is lesser possibility of those decisions impacting human rights negatively? What is the way that we could create an ethical possibility of it? And Feinberg suggests, therefore, the philosophers of science and technology, and I would add even STS scholars, interrogate the real process of lived experience of scientists in arriving at those decisions. And I think it's methodologically a different approach, and it is a non-normative approach, or it is theorizing the practice approach, and therefore it is different, and it complements the current engagement of human rights scholars interrogating technology.